Chapter 3 material. Chapter 3 is the final chapter leading to test number 1. I'm about to give you a ton of information you've never heard before. It coincides with what's in the textbook, but there's additional information, and I try to give it greater clarity. So you really need this information. You need to take good, close notes. I'm about to spell out a bunch of differences for you between the southern colonies, which are centered around the Chesapeake, and that's this area right here. And we're talking about the 1600s, the first century of America's development, versus New England. Now here's the essential truth. In the 1600s, and that's the 17th century, settlers from England, in some broad sense, established two clusters of settlement along the eastern seaboard. It began with Jamestown and Virginia and then spreads down ultimately all the way to Georgia. That's the South. And then a cluster of settlements gets established as English people start with Plymouth Plantation and then go on with Massachusetts Bay Colony and then fan out and create the Puritan colonies, and then they'll kind of blend into the middle colonies. Now, this is stuff that you already know. Why is that significant? It is English people who did this. They're from England. Now, many of my students don't know about this and probably don't care. They're English. So what does that mean? Many of my students, and many Americans don't understand. British? What's that? What's British? And what's Great Britain? What's England? Well, these are the British Isles, ladies and gentlemen. This little tiny cluster of land the size of Louisiana ultimately conquered the world. The people who established these colonies came from this zone right there, just that zone. That is England. As the British Isles developed over time, going back to antiquity, going back thousands of years, suffering from various invasions. By the time we're talking about, England had, from its ancient times, included various different white ethnic groups, tribes basically, who despised each other and developed very different cultures. This part, England, Angleland, was invaded at one point by the Angles and the Saxons. These are basically blonde-haired barbarian tribes, speaking kind of Germanic languages in ancient times. They beat up the local people and got established there and called it Angleland. Hence we got the term Anglo-Saxon. Up here, that's the land of the Scots, a Celtish people. They're white. Many of them had red hair, reddish hair. They speak Gaelic. They speak Celtic language. They despise these people. They fought with them through eternity. You don't call a Scotsman an Englishman, he'll kill you. Over here we have the Irish, a totally different tribe, also Celtic. America's origins were established by people just from this little tiny corner of the world. And if you look specifically at England, it's divided up into regions. They have regional accents and stuff. The people who generally speaking, the people who established the colonies associated with New England came from East Anglia. You see, in that part of England, you'll see a bunch of place names like Boston and Cambridge, which have been planted in New England. And the people who established the southern colonies tended to come from the West Midlands, and they had different accents, and their accents are the basis of the New England accent, which is like Pakya Khan Harvard Yard, versus the southern accent, which is a drawl. Yeah, roots all the way back. But my bottom line is they came from a little tiny area, an area so small I don't even know if it's the size of LA County, frankly. It's a small area. So let's just say it's small. It's probably larger than LA County. They come from the same gene pool, and yet over time, reacting to circumstances, reacting to the environment and climate, and they develop very, very differently. They're going to develop different, the South versus the North are going to develop very different economic and labor systems and political points of view, to the point where by 1860 they're ready to kill each other. In some broad sense, the white folks here are ready to kill the white folks here, although their gene pool originated in the same spot. That just shows you the incredible impact of time and geography and circumstances on a group of people who are essentially the same. Now let's get into it. I'm going to compare now the North and the South in the 1600s, focusing on various characteristics: labor, family, life expectancy. Here we go. In a nutshell, by the mid-1600s, the economic system that took root in the South consisted of plantation agriculture. That was your most productive unit. Plantation agriculture, what does that mean? Well, that means you got a guy who owns a big chunk of land and he's got some people working it for him. It is the opposite of a family-owned farm. And the basic economic unit of the South was to create, was to plant the cash crops, a single cash crop. And throughout Maryland and Virginia, the most profitable thing was tobacco. I told you how down in South Carolina, rice became the principal product. And in North Carolina and some other parts of the South, indigo was a plant used to produce blue dye. Tobacco was the big money maker. So you got a guy who controls a big chunk of land. He's got some people working for him. That's the nature of things. Now, who did the dirty work? Who's doing the labor? Okay, let me just feed it to you. In the 1600s, the vast majority of people doing the handwork, the back work, the labor were indentured servants. 80%. So I just told you 70-80% of the people who are of the white people who are migrating to the Chesapeake region were indentured servants. They were not slaves. They were emphatically not slaves. Yes, slaves were introduced. The very first slaves were introduced in 1619, but they were just a handful. The people who did the dirty work in establishing America's foundation in the 1600s in colonial Virginia and the colonial South were white people, working class, basically the poor people of England. Now, what's an indentured servant? Why do they come? What do they get? An indentured servant is a person who's basically contracted himself out, just about body and soul, just about, for a period of time. He's not a slave. It's a temporary condition. And anybody willing to do that's going to come from the poorest background in England. That is somebody with no opportunity. Somebody, the landless sons of peasants who will never inherit land, convicts, people on the bottom of society hoping to get out of that. People with some ambition. The only kind of woman who's going to do that is a young woman who sees no prospects there. She's not going to come over married. The married couple's not going to do it. These people are going to be young, they're going to be single, and they're going to be basically desperate and yet hopeful. This actually is a copy of an indenture, a true indenture of the sort that would have been filled out. It's a legal contract. It's a binding contract, an enforceable contract. You can't read it, neither can I. Here's a big blown up indenture, kind of a representation of what it was like, and I filled in the blanks for you. This is a legal contract between the master, who's the boss, and the servant who's selling labor to the boss, and look what it involves. I'm trying to get to the point. Why did they do this? What were they after? The indentured servants, what were they trying to get? So this is an indenture made in the time of King Charles. It involves Maryland. Witness that the servant hereby covenants and promises to the master and the master's executors and assignees. In other words, I'm going to sell myself to you for a period of time, and if you die, you're my boss. If you die, this piece of paper, you can give it to your heirs. And then I owe them my labor until my contract is complete, is fulfilled. They had to negotiate the term. It's going to be 4, 5, 6 years, depending on the deal. In such service and employment as the said master or his assignee shall therefore employ him, in consideration whereof the said master. Here's the payoff. The master promises to the servant to pay for his passing, to find him with meat, drink, and apparel, and lodging, and other necessaries during said term, and at the end of said term to give him 1 whole year's provisions of corn and 50 acres of land according to the order of the country. This is an early indenture with the best possible outcome. I'm going to give you 50 acres of land, Jack, and the wherewithal to make it go. And that's your ticket to respectability. Psst, that's the American dream. Now, what the nature of society that takes form because of this, you're bringing in an army, overwhelming and outnumbering everybody else, an army of these young, low-class men. Look what you've done. A high percentage of them are these, again, young peasants seeing no other opportunity. Just think about what a weird society that is. And inadvertently, they had created a society of, let me put this in plain terms. They had created a society overwhelmingly dominated by horny young men, like these dudes here, like these idiots here. And that's no good. Everybody knows that. When you create a society where 80% of the people there are footloose and foolish young men, you've just created the most unstable society on earth. And they had done that. Yet there it was. Now, life expectancy is at high or low. For the people living in Virginia and in Maryland in the 1620s and 1640s and 1650s, did they live a long time or were their lives short? Their lives were short. Life expectancy is incredibly low. How low was it? Well, here's your answer. Let's just say it was, most people were played out and died by the time they were about 40. How do we know this? This is the kind of research that historians have done in the modern times. They dig up whatever existing records be found from churches and parishes and whatever kind of civic records are kept. This is no doubt from a PhD thesis of a Harvard student, done in the 1960s. He focused on Middlesex County, Virginia, which is in the center of what we're talking about. In 1650, he looked at all the records he could find. He finds out if a man reached the age of 20, he'd probably live 25 more years and then drop dead at 45. If a woman reached the age of 20, she might live 20 more years and then she'd be played out and drop dead at 40. Why'd the woman die younger? Childbirth probably tore her up. So to speak, Now check it out. Fully 40% of the people who did go there as indentured servants didn't even get through their 4 or 5 years. They died before then. So they never got anything. They never got any payback. They didn't understand the concept of an American dream, but their dream didn't work. So they're out of the picture altogether. Now, what you could ask, why is life expectancy so low? Well, these things are going on down there in the Chesapeake region in particular. The climate is humid and hot. It's not exactly tropical, but it's warm and humid. I talked about how from the very earliest settlements, the high water table, the presence of swampy land, mosquitoes, malaria, bad water full of salt that people continued to drink was killing people. Just check it out. The sites of the first English settlements were coastal estuaries and mouths of rivers. The mixture of salt water and standing pools and marshes became stagnant and filthy, excellent breeding ground for harmful bacteria and mosquitoes. Frequently, the salt level in the water was as high as 5 times what it should have been. Weakened by long voyages, settlers fell prey to salt poisoning, mosquito-borne malaria. So that's what killed them. And then I'm here to tell you the fact that 80% of the people living there were indentured servants. The high percentage of indentured servitude also contributed to high rates of death. Can you understand why? The fact that a whole bunch of these guys are young guys who are indentured servants is contributing to their short lifespan. Can anybody figure that out? Well, you got to be more specific than that. A whole bunch of them are indentured servants. Does the boss care about the indentured servant? No. He's just a hand, and that's what they called him. My hands, I got 40 hands here. Put them to work. I owe them nothing. They owe me their labor. They're over here. That's the best they can do. If they don't like it, it's too late now. So are they going to be fed a decent diet? More than likely not, unless they're relying on the Christian charity of a boss, and they're not going to show a lot of charity. The working conditions are going to be extremely hard. They're going to work those people to the bone. And they did, and they died at a higher rate than people elsewhere. Okay, let me just get a little bit more done. Now, family life is the most basic human unit. Human beings want to establish family. It was the tradition of the monogamous household. A man and a woman had become deeply entrenched in Western civilization, not necessarily in other civilizations like Islam, where they do permit polygamy, but in the West, marriage between a man and woman had become the norm, and human beings throughout the civilization, not even civilizations, throughout the history of the human race, have tended in this direction. And everybody understands that the family is, if nothing else, its sociological function is to produce children and then teach those children how to survive. Basically teach them how to behave. The English who got settled in the Chesapeake wanted to do that. They wanted to follow the English customs. They couldn't. They could not establish family life. Why? Because there weren't enough women. There are just a very small number of women, and everybody's dying at a pretty young age. Women are being outnumbered 3-to-1 or 6-to-1. This means that a high percentage of men could not marry. There was no woman for them to marry. So that we know that because many men died with property, with no one to leave it to. The length of the marriage. Your typical marriage in the Chesapeake region in the 1600s lasted half of them only last 7 years. Why, that is a marriage, or at least a separation or divorce rate that puts Las Vegas marriages to shame. Why is that? Why are marriages so short? One spouse or the other died, which creates a situation where the surviving spouse, if it's a woman, that surviving spouse is going to be married. Some other man is going to snap her up and marry as fast as he can. And if it is a man who survives, he's going to be seeking another spouse. So the situation that developed family-wise in the South, in the Chesapeake, was that the families that existed often consisted of a bunch of step-parents and a series of step-children. Very little continuity. Only 1/3 of the 18-year-olds had both parents alive. That means that they're being raised by step-parents. A lot of discontinuity among the generations. Typical family size is quite small. We've run out of time, though. That's enough. Here comes a bunch of details you've never heard before. We'll never need to know again. But it's a story about people adapting to their environment, bringing their culture with them, how the people, their culture, the environment interact. So I'm giving you a quick description of the fundamental aspects of the southern colonies as they took root in the 1600s, the first century of American development. And I talk about all these things: plantation labor, indentured servants, and the fact that it's an indentured servant labor force, which constitutes a majority of society, just totally determines the nature of that situation. It's just fundamental. High death rates. The death rates are due to the environmental conditions and the fact that a whole bunch of guys that are indentured servants are being worked to death, basically, because there's no concern about their welfare, ultimately, their hands. Then we get to the basic aspects of human behavior. Basic aspects of human behavior. The desire to have a relationship of the traditional sort, which is commonplace among most people at that time and embraced by society. They couldn't do it. The desire to have a family. Many of them couldn't do it because of the circumstances. So the marriages that do exist are typically short. The children they have are few. Why is that? Now, finally, why do they have so few children? Now, what's interesting about that is, they're not having less sex. There's a group of people just like they are, the same gene pool, about 1,000 miles away from them, further north, and those people are having 10 kids. How come they're only able to, when there's a married couple, they only have 2 or 3? Well, one thing is high infant mortality. The infant mortality rates were high down in the South. Down in the southern colonies, 3 out of 5 died in infancy. versus only 1 out of 5 up in the New England colonies. So that's a significant thing, and that's the thing that your textbook emphasizes. But now it's time for you to listen. There is another factor that was present among the people living in the southern colonies that resulted in, when they did having a marriage, when they were able to have a marriage, there were fundamental factors that restricted how many kids they could have, beyond infant mortality, beyond the fact that a bunch of people are dying because of the disease environment. And it has to do with the fact that essentially all the women who arrived there in the 1600s, 1650, 1660, came as indentured servants. Now, I just threw out a hint to you. I just told you the fact that most women were indentured servants wound up limiting how many kids they could have. Now, how's that possible? Can anybody answer that question? Say what? They were required to remain single. They're not free to marry. They could not legally marry. And if they do have a child, it'll be out of wedlock and it'll be their fault. And they'll pay for that in a variety of ways. Therefore, here we go. The impact of indentured servitude on women. Women had to marry, if they were going to marry legitimately, they had to marry later. So if they're going to come there at the age of 20, 18, they're going to be wrapped up, tied up in indentured servitude. Let's assume that they come at the age of 20. They're wrapped up in indentured servitude for 4 or 5 years. Maybe they come even later, so they're tied up until the age of 27. Then they'll be snapped up because women were so rare. They'll be married. And then they may well die at the age of 35 or 40. That's why they have so few children, absolutely. Their childbearing years typically were limited by the fact that so many women lost their low 20s to mid 20s to indentured servitude. That's a simple fact. And then here's another category of evaluation, a separate category, kind of like family life. The situation for women, where the situation meaning the possibility of the women who are going there as indentured servants are going there to do better. They're risking their lives and leaving their homes in all things familiar to go to a highly dangerous and unknown situation to do better. And how does a woman do better? By marrying somebody who's got some money. That's the bottom line. Or some property or something. By marrying somebody seemingly in a better economic and social situation than the one they came from. That's why they're going. That's the women's American dream. They didn't know, know that term, but that's what we're talking about. Was that a possibility for women in the Chesapeake region in the South? Yes, absolutely. If they lived. Now, just make a quick point about how difficult the situation was for women. This is a quote from a source I use. Nearly all the early incoming women came as indentured servants. Typical age was between 18 and 25. Yeah, of course they're coming single. They have to if they're an indentured servant. She's in search of a husband because that's what was the socially acceptable way to move upward. If there are some instances of a highly bold woman coming over for her own grant of land, there must be, but I'm not aware of them. That wouldn't be the norm because society didn't promote that. First, she was obliged to serve out her indenture, since the law forbade a servant to marry until she completed a contract. That might mean 5 years must pass. Devastating years, exposure to malaria, physical labor harder than anything she'd known. In addition to household chores, she had the fields to tend, so she's out there in the blazing sun and the heat and the humidity on an isolated farm, and these farms were isolated. She's under the thumb of these people, and they can basically exploit her any way they want to. If the woman bore a bastard child, and that's what they called children born out of wedlock, it's highly stigmatized, a disgrace to be born out of wedlock. And the woman who bears the bastard child carries that stigma too, according to the conventions of the time. 1 out of every 5 women did precisely that, a much higher rate of illegitimacy than in England. because they were under such intense sexual pressure. She paid heavily if she got pregnant and had a kid. She's going to be punished. She'll have to pay back the time she loses when she's unable to work hard. Her kid might be basically sold out, bound out as an indentured servant as soon as that kid's ready to lift a finger. That's the way it was. And yet, a woman who survived in Maryland and Virginia in 1660, in some broad sense, had more. I'm sure I doubt very much if women were thinking about their lives in these terms, but freedom, independence, or the possibility to make some independent decisions and even, perhaps even acquire wealth. How's that? Well, first of all, you will marry up more than likely because you're going to have a pick of many, many different husbands, and you'll be able to pick the one who offers the best situation. Typically, that means money, not love, money. It means money, money and property. So that's step one up. Step two up. What if the old man dies? You've got his stuff. And then you can do with it pretty much what you want for a period of time. If you have kids, the male sons will take it away from you sooner or later. But you also don't have any in-laws. There were no in-laws alive. Nobody is controlling your fate. Nobody's breathing down your neck. You guys understand what I'm saying? If you cared about that, and I don't know how many women did, the ability to have some space of your own, if you lived, that was the place. Otherwise, it was a terrible place. Many didn't live. Now, on to this subject. Settlement patterns. We're going to compare settlement patterns north and south. Settlement patterns in the southern colonies. That's the way society lays itself out, the way society gets structured physically and the geography. Well, this is not the way the South was in the 1600s. This is a picture of a fancy plantation with a bunch of slave huts. This did not come to the South in the 1600s. This is not going to be present in the South until basically 100 years later, like 1750. So I shouldn't show you this, but it's a kind of an interesting picture. This is the way the southern colonies laid themselves out because of cotton, because of the kind of agriculture they're doing in particular. This is a true map. It's a kind of simple map, but a true map of basically the heart of Virginia, and that therefore in some sense the heart of America. There's the James River. There's old Jamestown, the first settlement that actually stuck. And as decades went by, and tobacco became the basis for economic activity, plantation agriculture, Jamestown was abandoned. Nobody wanted to be stuck there. They go out on their plantations, and so the South, Virginia and Maryland become a place where there are not cities and not towns. People are not settling there. They need to be out on their plantation, working their land. This is a good indication of how scattered these places were. Every one of these seems to be some kind of city or something. It's not. These are not cities. These are plantations. These are large plantations, remote, widely separated, all the way up. And look how tobacco, given the knowledge of agriculture at the time, just tore up the soil, depleted it so rapidly. My information is you can get 2 good seasons of tobacco. That's all. And then you could put corn there for the next 3 years, and then you have to leave that land alone and let it lie fallow for years. And when you are using land at that rate, you can see how land is used and then kind of left fallow, and they get more land, and they spread and they spread and they spread. This is how Virginia spreads into the interior very quickly. In the South generally, land extensive. And so it's going to be a place that almost from the very beginning, when agriculture, commercial agriculture becomes established as the basis of the economy, it's not going to be a place that forms itself into little villages that become that become towns, that become cities. Very few, right up to the Civil War, right up to, if we're starting in the 1607, technically, we're in the 1650s. 200 years later, the South is not going to have many cities. Now, the last category we're going to evaluate is social mobility for men in particular. Social mobility for men, because men represented the majority of the indentured servants. Men were coming over doing most of the land grabbing. The men who are coming over as indentured servants are from the lower classes of England. and they're coming there to get some land. That's their measure of social mobility. That's their American dream. Did they do that? Was that the norm? Was there a high rate of success, or is that all false and kind of a fraud? Well, historians have done some studying about this. These people are coming over as indentured servants to get land. Land signified in America status. Suddenly, your low class origins are washed away if you are a landowner. Did they do that? Well, yeah. On the whole, yes. That is the secret of America and a distinctive thing about America's origins. Like what? Now, don't forget. Well, it's not a clear picture. Fully 40% of the indentured servants die because it was such a terrible situation in the 1600s. But if you don't count those people, and let's not count them because they're dead. Let's count the people who live. And studies have been done about this, the kind of things that modern historians do. And one study indicated, looking at Virginia, they tried to track as many indentured servants as they could, and they found that 30 of those they were able to track, 37% became large to middle landowners, and then an additional 25% at least, when they got out of indentured servitude, got some land, and could say that they owned land. Well, if you add 37 and 25, you get 62%. 62% went from being nobody and nothing, basically a semi-slave, to being a property holder, a freeholder in Virginia. And that is an incredibly high rate of success, probably the highest in the world. No wonder that the American colonies became a magnet for the people who could and had the means to get over here that period of time. Not for the Native Americans, they're being moved out. And ultimately not for slaves when they start to come in, but slaves were not coming in large numbers at this time. Now, to show you how these people lived, I will take the time to briefly show you a little video. Obviously, the terrain where all this stuff took place is still there. Maryland is an odd-shaped state based on its colonial charter, carved out of this land here. It grew up around the Chesapeake Bay, and its earliest cities are right down there, right on that little peninsula sticking way out in the Chesapeake Bay. St. Mary's City is one of the oldest cities in the United States, and in the heart of old Maryland. It's still there, and you can go visit it. And there's a living history museum called the Josiah Spray Plantation, where they've actually tried to recreate the living circumstances for the early planters in 1650, and I'm going to show you some scenes from that. Here's Virginia down here. I've actually created a little video with a narration to it. This is a modern tobacco plant in a field in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. See how lush and thick the leaves are? This is the end result of about 400 years of crossbreeding that has created a plant for maximum production. This is not the kind of plant that the Chesapeake colonists produced in the 1600s. What they produced looked like this, these scrawny little plants. These plants have been kind of re-engineered on a living history museum in southern Maryland called the Josiah Spray Plantation. See this field on the Josiah Spray Plantation outside of St. Mary's City? It looks like a field full of weeds, but in fact this is a field full of highly valuable tobacco. They didn't waste their time cleaning up the fields. It was all quick and dirty. Here we see Josiah Spray. This is a historic interpreter playing the role of the master of this plantation in the 1650s. There's his indentured servant. These are the kind of men who were dying in their mid-40s because of the harsh circumstances there. This is the cottage of Josiah Spray. You can see that it's modest. This is not a mansion. It's on the order of an English country cottage. It has some basic amenities like a wooden floor and a nice brick chimney. It has everything he needs, but it's not a mansion. There is vegetable fields, and beyond that are his tobacco fields. This is the primitive shack of the indentured servant. Inside, you're going to see that the floors are made of hardened earth. He's hoping to live through his period of indenture so that he can become a plantation owner himself. Here is Josiah Spray in his curing shed. What he has there is some freshly harvested tobacco. And what he needs to do is put it in his curing shed. That's what he's preparing those steaks for. And he'll hang it there for a few days where it's receiving just the amount of heat and it needs in order to become usable tobacco, still moist but dry enough for transport. So his wealth is in that curing shed. This is like $100 bills hanging from the roof, and that'll all be collected and put into casks and rolled out to ships to be exported to Great Britain. So these are the circumstances under which, in some sense, the United States was born, in the tobacco fields of colonial Virginia. Done with that. Boom. Flipping to the opposite pole of the American colonies. Now talking about the North, but what I'm really concentrating on is the kind of society and economy that took root in New England. This area in particular that has similar characteristics to those that get established in the middle colonies, but the New England is the heart of it. We're going to look at the same kind of characteristics: economy, labor, life expectancy, and on and on. See that house? That is called a salt box house of the sort that was built by the 1680s in Massachusetts, and you find them, they're still up. That's a pretty nice structure with a lot of rooms to accommodate a lot of people. Here's the deal. I'm going to race right through it. The economy that gets established in New England in particular was an economy dominated by subsistence agriculture on family farms. Subsistence agriculture. And I'll just let you know that when I'm talking about a subsistence farm and a subsistence farmer, we're talking about a household that is producing a variety of things. It's got a cow or some cattle, it's got some pigs, it's got some chickens, it's growing some wheat, it's growing some vegetables, and it consumes most of what it produces. The family does. They might produce a little bit of surplus wheat and sell that to neighbors to get some cash money, but it is not. It is the exact opposite of a plantation, where the objective is to grow one thing, like tobacco, and sell that for money, and then use the money to buy the things you need. And on a plantation, you've got a boss, a master, who is employing a bunch of people. Later on, he'll have slaves, but in the 1600s, employing people. This is a family-owned farm. Therefore, who does the work? Who's doing the work? You tell me. Who are the laborers? Your own family members. Your sons, your daughters, in some instances your cousins, in-laws, they're doing that work. And you can't imagine how totally different that makes things. In addition to the fact this is in New England, we're talking about a group of people who are all members essentially of a religious sect who believe the same thing, and they're there because they want to be. So New England is going to develop from the very beginning as a society dominated by families, because family life was the center of Puritan life. If you are not part of a family, you just don't belong. And they'll settle themselves into communities of families. It's the opposite of a society of horny young men. It is the opposite of this. It is more like this. Grandpa, grandma, daddy, passel of kids. That's what it's like. One family after another duplicating itself like that 1,000 times and 10,000 times. And they're overwhelmingly, they have land. They came with money. They parceled out land. The norm is for every household to be situated on some land that they own. Life expectancy, high or low. Well, I'm here to tell you their life expectancy was incredibly high. That is, they lived very, very long lives. It's extraordinary. How long? How good was their life expectancy? Let me tell you that New England, the states of New England, are dotted with untold thousands of graveyards full of old graves dating back to the 1600s and 1700s. And this is just one. This is the gravestone of Hazel Elpon Wood, who is the widow of Obadiah Wood. She died in 1714 when she was 78 years old. Pretty damn good, if you care about those things. And that's representative of what was going on there. This is a study done by some poor graduate student way back when in the 60s, doing the same thing, looking at real concrete evidence to see how long people lived, looking at church records and civic records. His conclusion, or her conclusion, was that if a man lived to 20, he'd live at least 45 more years. And these are low estimates. If a woman makes it to 20, she'll make it to at least 60 overall. So let's just say, here's your answer. How long is life expectancy in the New England colonies and the North generally? Over 60 years of age. And why is that? How could that be? It must have been one of the healthiest places on earth, I imagine. I mean, just think about this. In the United States of America in the year 1900, the life expectancy for typical Americans was 47. Here I'm talking about people living into their 70s. 200 years earlier, 300 years earlier. So, yeah, the environment of New England was less disease-ridden. Yes, it's colder. Malaria was not endemic and kind of planted in the environment there. And I'm here to, also, it has to be said, the fact that most people there were not indentured servants. Most people there were beloved members of families, and therefore they're working for their family benefit. And so let's assume they got treated better and ate better. Let's assume all those things, because I think it's reasonable to assume that. Yeah, that allows you to live longer. Yes, absolutely. The absence of indentured servitude, the limited nature of that in that area, and the fact that most people were free and of equal status. Yes. Now, other things. Family life, what about that? They couldn't establish stable family life down in the South. What do they got going in the North? Very strong family life. It's the center of everything, because that was a basic aspect of Puritan belief. In some broad sense, they felt that God's hierarchy was established in the family. There should be a father. There should be a mother, and so on and so on. There should be children who are obedient to those people. And you've got a situation from the very beginning. They came over as a community of believers according to their religious system. They came over as families to begin with. They came over with a more or less equal sex ratio to start with. And then they begin to have all kinds of kids. So you've got a reasonably equal number of men and women. They're eager to marry. They're told to marry. It's part of their culture. So everyone is expected to marry. If you're able to marry and there's a mate for you, you are expected to marry. Someone who doesn't marry is violating the code of Puritan behavior. And therefore, since people are living so long, you're going to have a situation where you have living not only grandparents, but very possibly great-grandparents, and then grandparents, and then the parents, and then the kids. Things that were impossible in the South. Family size was enormous. Your typical family produced 6 to 8 kids, and that's the information I want you to have. Now, your book will make reference to families that have more than that as being quite normal, and that's true, but you stay with 6 to 8. And that's plenty enough, isn't it? 7 to 10 children per family was not unusual. Here, just to give you an illustration of how many kids people had. Okay, Benjamin Franklin, you all know who he is. He wound up in his life in Pennsylvania and in Philadelphia, but he came from a Puritan background and a Puritan household, which he found oppressive and left. He was one of 17 kiddies his mommy had. 17. She knocked him out. The governor of Massachusetts at one point who was an American-born Puritan, who became wealthy enough and well connected enough to become governor. He was one of 26 children his mother had. That means that she was pregnant every cycle she could be until she entered menopause. She lived to tell the tale. So why are these people having so many kids? Why would they want to do that? You're growing your own labor force. And when you're on the land, you're not working for wages, you're on the land, you grow more food. Everything grows and grows and grows. Now, another factor that contributes to so many, their desire was to have kids. The kids were functional in their lives, and they could have more kids, and they have a low infant mortality rate. But don't forget, those families are able to have so many kids because the women were not indentured servants. That's a key thing. The women are not indentured servants typically. Therefore, they are raised kind of in the claustrophobic and stuffy and stifling, but nonetheless loving environment of their families. But they're encouraged to marry. Absolutely. Go out and marry some good Christian Puritan man as soon as you can. Chastity, and she'll do that at the age of 18, 19, or 20, and then she'll be able to have children for 40 years or more. So they've got longer life and they've got longer childbearing years, and that's all there is to it. That's all there is to it. Now, in terms of settlement patterns, I talked about how the South was scattered. What have you got in New England? The opposite, the absolute opposite. The Puritans came from little villages centered around a church. The church was the focal point of everything. And they came to New England to do the same thing. So they will begin by settling in clusters of villages that will grow into towns, that will grow into cities. This is a classic shot of a true town outside of Boston called Sudbury, Massachusetts. Going back to its early Puritan days. This would be its earliest founding families. Look what they've done here. These people are farmers, but they have settled. Those little dots represent where they've settled, and they've all settled along the village common. See how that's called the cow common? That was common land owned by the village as a whole, collectively, where everybody could put their cows out and so forth. Today, the largest park in Boston is the Boston Common, which was public land going back to Boston's original founding. That's the way they did it. When you hear about songs about New England, I met her on the village green. That's it. And then they're all there, and there's your church. And as they have a bunch of babies and their kids grow up to maturity, they'll spread out, and then finally they'll split off into a separate community when they get to a certain level of 30, 40, 50 households. They'll get a charter to establish a new town. Everybody's here together, and their fields are out here. They walk to the fields. They want to do it that way. They don't have to, but they want to. Now here's somebody living out there. Now what are they doing out there? Which is a question they'd ask. Why are they out there? What are they doing? They could be witches. And they could be, So that would be their point of view. You can, as I have shown you this before, you can go to, this is a scene from Plymouth Plantation, the Living History Museum outside of Plymouth, Massachusetts, where they tried to recreate how closely these people lived together. Social mobility for men or for women, the desire of these people who come to America to move up in the social system. Well, you know what? I'll just tell you this. I don't think it was a big deal for the Puritans. Their highest goal was to be godly as a man and godly as a woman, whatever that meant to them, and it meant clear and concrete things to them. A Puritan boy is brought up to be a godly man. And in the process, as a Puritan, you work hard at your calling, whatever it is. And you'll do well if you work hard at your calling. And they often did do well. Not always, but often. So I just don't think the desire to get rich was part of their scheme. They didn't come from the bottom of society. They didn't aspire to riches or high distinction in terms of their wealth or status. That wouldn't be a very Puritan thing. And as for the women, the situation for women, well, they lived a long time, didn't they? And they were a fundamental part of Puritan life. Certainly they were. And the women, of course, were central to everything in terms of child raising, family economy. And I assume that those women were brought up, most of them, to accept and embrace the confines of their lives. But if you think about a woman's life in terms of her ability to exercise some independent thought, that was not present in Puritan New England, because it was a place where daddy is in charge. According to the order of God, this was from their point of view. From their point of view, Puritan New England was a patriarchy in which the man controlled things and was the source of all authority. And so women who grew up in that environment are going to be raised with that idea in mind. And when the woman leaves her home family and is married, she'll be brought into that other family where she'll be under the scrutiny of all of these in-laws, maybe 2 generations of it, mother-in-law, and then the grandparents-in-law. The way the Puritans wanted their kids to behave, their women folk, their girl children, is kind of symbolized and illustrated by the names they would often give to their female children, such as Prudence. Be prudent. Don't be reckless. Patience. Your role in life is to be patient. Hope. It's good to have hope. Hope. Chastity. Practice chastity. Absolutely. In other words, these people are not calling their daughters Jezebel or Ruby or something like that. So, having said all those things, here's a quick summary. Over in 100 years of development, from the early 1600s to 1700, this is what happens in the Chesapeake region in particular. They received all of those immigrants from outside the area, the vast majority of them being white people from England. And by 1700, there are only 88,000 of them alive. That's how deep-seated the disease situation and how short life expectancy was. That's the South. Now watch what happened. In the North, what have you got? Well, I'll just say that you know that the bulk of the Puritans, both the so-called Pilgrims and then the people who founded Massachusetts Bay Colony, they were Congregationalists. And they left England because they felt the sting of oppression. Because they held an ideology that was contrary to the Church of England. They were critical of the Church of England, which was the King's Church. They wanted it to be a stiffer, sterner, purer church. That's why they're called Puritans. And so for a period of time, they felt some political persecution of a sort, and it made them enough for them to want to leave. But by 1640, they didn't need to leave England anymore, because as a matter of fact, in the 1640s, England undergoes a revolution where the king is actually overthrown and then decapitated, killed. They commit regicide, which means the killing of the king. And the revolution in England was led powerfully by Puritan leaders, such as Oliver Cromwell. In other words, the kind of middle-class, self-righteous Puritans staged a revolution and overthrew the monarchy for a period of time. And they were in charge, and England ceased to be a monarchy for a period, and then they'll eventually invite the monarchy back. But at this point, they didn't need to come anymore. So in the history of New England, a total of 14,000 Puritans go. Basically, that's the bottom line. By 1700, they'd proliferated into 93,000. Those 14,000 created 93,000 by having babies. And then you can say this, that for the South, it'll be a place kind of rooted in a scattered population that's highly rural, very few cities. Therefore, when you have a city, when you don't have a city in your scattered plantations, it's hard to tax people for a road. It's hard to create a school, so there'll be less investment in kind of social capital and social properties, community properties. In the North, they'll want to have schools, and they'll start that early. They want those kids to read the Bible. They'll be gathered in a cluster. They'll have similar views. They'll be willing to tax themselves for better roads and better schools and all that thing. It'll be a more mixed economy too, where you'll start to see not only farmers, but you'll see people serving the farmers as blacksmiths and rope makers and cart makers and wheelwrights and all that stuff. Merchants. Now,